The first thing people are going to notice in episode 2 is that we're no longer following Thalius. We're introduced to not just one new plotline, but actually 3 new plotlines, or arcs as we call them. These are some of the main story arcs of Season 1, and this episode and the next few are what really introduce us to many of the characters and adventures that we'll be seeing for the whole series. David here, director of Songs of War, back with another behind the scenes. In episode 2, we quickly learned that the 2 characters we're following, Jalkar and Grimm, are technically bad guys. They're thieves breaking into the castle to steal the dragon egg. The design for Jalkar was made first, and seemed to just work well for a thief/mercenary. We gave him a variation of the skin which included his hood up, which seemed to be something he'd use on missions to avoid people recognizing him as easily. Grimm was initially going to be a human, and also in the Unyielding Legion with Jalkar. They both had matching robes. But in the script we had all his dialogue marked as grunts. It was like happy grunt or satisfied grunt, and it seemed weird for a human to be grunting, so it made more sense to change his species entirely. We also made him no longer a member of the Unyielding Legion group, which provides a bit more mystery as to why they're working together. Grimm's Scythe enchantment. This is where I designed some lightning bolts as particles to make doing lightning effects much more manageable. Like all enchantments in Songs of War, it has both the idle and the activated state. And we really wanted to emphasize the actual activation with this one. That way you get this nice kind of whoosh, it kind of turns on. Why did I make the sound? You're going to hear the sound. To make the world feel bigger, I created set extensions using trees. I tried a ton of different techniques at first to see which would be most efficient. I tried a design where I just made single 2D planes, then I upgraded that to be multiple planes as a kind of cross-section of a tree, which started to look weird when the trees were at different angles and it didn't really capture the light. I ended up having just a lot of normal trees being emitted as a hair simulation. Turns out that worked just fine and allowed me to extend the sets, which were already extremely large to begin with. Theria is where everything in this scene takes place. I think it was actually one of our earliest large castle builds, but it took quite a few iterations to get there. Many of the early designs were going for quite a different look. The lore behind this town was that it was a place for enchanters to train and practice, and a whole town kind of formed around this profession down below. I always associated enchanting with Ender technology, since a Minecraft enchanting table is made out of obsidian. If you were to continue a bit further up to the topmost tower, you'd actually have seen an ender crystal. We also needed the shop where the enchanters would sell enchanted weapons. It was important for me to make sure they were on display so we could capture some of that lore without having to explain it through exposition and dialogue. In the next scene, we meet Sen and Rhea. I think it was important that we follow characters a bit younger with more room to grow. Thalius is certainly interesting, but he's kind of seen it all, where Sen and Rhea are still eager to get out and explore, which I think then allows the viewer to kind of follow the characters who are learning about the universe, and you get to share their experiences and learn alongside them. That way, when they're surprised about some new thing they've never seen before, you're also seeing that for the first time. This section of the story takes place in Doria, one of the 5 Ardoni territories, and is where, you guessed it, the Sandaris clan lives. Makes it easy to remember. We wanted to differentiate Ardoni from humans in many ways. They live much more in harmony with their environments. You don't see them building buildings and structures. Instead, they just kind of find something natural like trees, hills, caves. They just kind of live in them. For Sandaria, we went with a really strong focus on water elements, such as the rivers nearby and the ponds. This helped emphasize the Sandaris blue color, as well as adding diamonds as the primary ore. I wrote a large section for these behind the scenes about the Ardoni culture, but honestly, it's a really deep and complex subject, and I'm not quite sure how interested everyone is in with the deeper lore of the series. I think I might save that for a more specific video later, or if you want to just catch me in some kind of Q&A, or there's definitely going to be more content than just these behind the scenes. I would like to briefly mention the ears on the Ardoni, which represent their age. As they get older, you'll notice their ears continue to get a little bit longer, if you compare like Thalius's ears to Sen's or someone. Also, the small part of Sendaria we saw this episode, it's technically just a single family, a Sivian's family. All the Ardoni Sen walked past on his way back to his room, those were Rhea's brothers. And you can see that Rhea and her brothers share very similar markings to a Sivian, the father. I had to deal with a bit of water awkwardness this episode. Water is always difficult in 3D. In the script, Sen is thrown into a pond while they're fighting, but when you go to do it in 3D, the character will simply just pass through the surface of the water without disturbing the water. I used a simulation effect to get a real basic wave animation to kind of ripple away, which is nice because it bounces off the side of the pool and gets nice reflections. I then added some bubble particles over top. Really though, what it was that carried that was just having sound design. When I put the sounds in there, everything really came together. On top of all that, the lily pads and the floating wheat weren't reacting, so I had to actually hand animate those to kind of move over the waves as they simulated. We also meet Luke in this episode, but unfortunately we only get a small scene with him. To contrast the primary Ardoni story arc, we wanted to tell a story following more of just a down-to-earth human. Unlike Sen and Rhea, he has a very different story and personality. He's not out to adventure or save the world. He kind of involves himself in petty crime and thievery, but that makes him a bit more unique. Designs early on were pretty barf-worthy. Then Nerf took the Lucan design and redid it completely, and like most things we redo for Songs of War, ended up much better. This was a scene where I really wanted a certain look for the room that Lucan and Marcus are talking in, where some warm light from outside would be shining through the window. I knew volumetric lighting had been too render intensive in the past, so I ended up faking it by designing 2D planes with simulated light rays, but it wasn't really enough when I had just shafts of light alone. I wanted the light to illuminate small pieces of dust suspended in the air. Having this little effect really helped give the indoor scenes just a bit of movement when everything else is really still. This was something that ended up being the light rays ended up being so efficient that it would eventually be used a lot throughout the series and improved upon. For example, when I finally returned to work on episode 1, I updated the light rays at Mount Velgrin to include tiny bits of ice particles instead of just dust, and the ice kind of had this twinkly look, as if like the light was kind of reflecting off the ice. It might be a good point to mention just a little bit about the songs and shrines. These songs are these objects they're given. They harness these powers from those objects, and they're able to, do the powers that you saw like in episode 1 in the battle. These shrines are related to the songs and how they harness them, and this was a design that we built ages and ages ago, before we even started the Songs of War World server. We made some designs on the Hypixel housing until we were happy with it, and then you'll see these around throughout the series. This episode you get a good look at the moon, which was actually handmade for this series. The moon in our night sky texture we had was looking a bit bleh, so I designed something a bit more fantasy-like. There's bits of gas clouds coming off of it. I tried to initially bring it into the world as an object, and just put it really far away, but I got a lot of problems with the depth, so I ended up just pasting it onto the sky itself. There are also different phases of the moon, which you'll see in future episodes. There was also a nice little detail where I used the reflection of the moon in the pond as a scene transition element. Rhea initially runs by in the direction going right, and then after the scene when they return they're heading left, and the moon is gone from the reflection, showing some passage of time. One thing I also started doing for this series that I had never used before was having some textured lights. You can see the difference this has on areas such as the shrine by throwing some light that looks like it's coming between branches. And here it is with just a regular spotlight. I did a basic procedural noise one as well that showed up on Mount Velgrin, and here's what that would have looked like if it was just a normal spotlight. This fireplace in Doria saw a lot of changes. We originally used the Minecraft fire before I had invented the better flame effects later in the series. We went back and replaced the fire, but then we noticed there wasn't anything actually burning, so we had to re-render to add some wood. It also spawned some memes because of how intense it looked. We wanted to have the episode kind of wrap back up around to where it started, so we finally see a glimpse at the end where the egg ended up that got teleported. but that's a story for next episode. Thanks everyone for watching. If you want to support this series, you can check out our Patreon. Now's a great time to pledge, as depending on the level you pledge to, you can get things like your name in the Songs of War episode credits, or simply get early access to each new episode and see it at least a good day before everyone else does. And with that, I will see you next episode.